Welcome to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined today by my guest, Jonathyne Briggs. Dr. Briggs is an associate professor and chair of history at Indiana University Northwest. And he published a book through Oxford University Press in 2015 called Sounds French, Globalization, Cultural Communities, and Pop Music. So welcome, Jonathyne. And
thanks, Tom.
If we can get started here, I'm going to enjoy this because I'm interested very much in this subject myself. But let's just talk about what we're going to get into here. What do we mean by cultural communities?
Well, what I was really interested in is talking about the ways in which French people themselves imagine their relationship to pop music. In many ways, similar to how Americans do. There are rap fans and there are country fans, and they often imagine themselves to share values, to share ideas. And I was interested in looking at this in a kind of a historical way, as a way of kind of getting at what was happening in France at this time in the 1960s, a time of great change in France as it was here in the United States. So that's kind of was my entryway into looking at this, the history of pop music there.
And there was a lot of political turmoil going on at the time.
Absolutely, yeah.
So give me an example of, one of the results of this influence of pop music and developments in post-World War II French culture.
Well, sure. Well, I mean, part of it was that a community of young people began to imagine themselves as young people, and often as young people connected to the ideas and values of young people outside of France. So
it's like the hippie movement in the United States.
Right, like the hippie movement, or like the ideas, well, Americans, they love the Beatles, who are British, and the French, they love the Beatles, so they must share a number of ideas. So what I see out of this is the kind of development of these kind of international connections, and that a lot of these protests that you're alluding to in the 1960s were very international in scope, and I see the kind of seedbed of this in the sharing of popular music and understanding popular music in these very similar ways.
So it seems to me, and just correct me here, but it seems to me that the movement in the United States was very focused on the United States.
Absolutely.
But some of the protest in France was against the Vietnam War, which the United States was waging, right?
Right.
And you also had the movement that was repressed in Eastern Europe. There was a youth movement, right, in Czechoslovakia,
Poland,
and that was a lot mostly a youth-driven movement in
absolutely.
Some places,
and
right?
so there was what popular music provided was a way to articulate this youth consciousness that they shared these values, and in many ways, I think one of the kind of important differences that in the United States, civil rights was, of course, a big part of the early kind of movements. And, of course, the Vietnam War did become it. And I think for the French, they often saw themselves as, well, they were better in terms of civil rights, when in fact in many ways they were not, but they imagined themselves to be.
Depends on which state they're comparing themselves to.
Exactly, right? Like they could appreciate Ray Charles, and he could play in any hall he wanted to in France, where there's still kind of
in the U.S.
the color barriers in the United States. Places, absolutely. So the French used this as a way to kind of bolster their own image, even though they didn't treat many of their own immigrant populations quite well. But this goes into a long history of the French and jazz, and so what I was interested in is, well, how does this change with something? Jazz has it has an aura. It's an art, right? We've accepted it as a form of serious art. I don't think at that time, I don't think it was the same for something like Elvis Presley, which was seen more as like barbaric. Or
interestingly enough, I was in Paris the day Elvis died.
Interesting.
And it was a big headline. And it was, and I, at that point in Elvis's career, he was kind of this lounge lizard, and I didn't have a lot of respect for him. And I was kind of surprised it was big. I mean, it looked like war had been declared. And I was with some other students. We were on our way back to the States, and we spent the whole day looking for a jukebox with an Elvis Presley record on it. When we found it, we played it over and over again and drank too much beer, and then went to the airport. Yeah.
But in that same sense, like Elvis had this deep resonant meaning to it.
He did, yeah.
But it operated too outside of the fashions of the U.S., which had moved on to kind of other icons, the Rolling Stones or the Who or somebody else who articulated that kind of youth empowerment, which is funny now considering they themselves have become dinosaurs in their own right.
Now, what used to be called the movement in the U.S. It was sort of this generic term, and it meant stop the war. Drugs are okay. Make love with anyone you want whenever you feel like it, and power to the people, I guess, right? And civil rights. It was just sort of all of these things piled into one. We got into the 70s, and it sort of evolved into. It lost a lot of the momentum that it had, right? The war issues were resolved, and it became sort of the ecology movement, and it became women's rights. What was the focus in France, and where did that end up as you moved past the 60s into the 70s and into the 80s? Because at some point, the Woodstock generation became the yuppie generation.
Absolutely.
There was a great ad in one of the Super Bowls, and it was somebody's idea of what the Woodstock Revival would be like, and it was all these people with BMWs and cell phones, waiting around for the music.
And we have evidence of it. There already was the Woodstock Revival.
So
right?
They actually did that. Yeah. So what was the nature of that transition in France?
In many ways, it was the same, except I would say in France there was an important division. There were those who became very, very serious about political change. Maoists and Trotskyites, and they believed in this sort of revolutionary idea through political revolution. But those that fascinate me even more were those that were interested in kind of culture, what we might call cultural revolution.
Right.
So, yes, playing 20-minute rock songs to kind of change people's minds and expand their consciousness.
So so they had French rock songs that they were playing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And there were bands that attempted to create alliances with political groups, and they were trying to carry on these ideas from what they perceived as this failed revolution in '68. They were trying to say, well, the reason it failed is that people's minds weren't open enough. So very much these kind of channelings that you were talking about in America. We see much of the same thing in France, and what it ends up doing is kind of dividing, like variegating this movement, so to speak.
And as we look back on America, like it was this terribly disruptive period, but it seems to me that it was a deeper seated movement in France. And
absolutely.
It was more radical. Was that in part because they were reacting against de Gaulle?
I mean, it was certainly not just de Gaulle, although he did play this kind of big part as playing up this authority figure, right? He was like the ultimate authority figure. But I would also say that the French believed themselves to be these kind of pioneers of revolution, right? The French are a revolutionary people,
We just
so to
had
speak.
one revolution. They had one every 15 minutes.
Right, they're still waiting on their next. They keep waiting for another one. So I think that young people believed at the time that there was the potential to have a real revolution there. So I think that's why there was a kind of stronger emphasis. And of course, they always saw themselves as leaders, where a revolution in France could change the world in a different way than, say, a revolution in America could.
Right.
Although I would argue, like, America was very influential in what happened and what was going on in France in '68 and beyond.
It's curious to me that there were French songs about revolution, because I was in France for a month last summer, and my first night there, I happened to walk into an open mic night and met a bunch of the musicians. And they invited me to all the other open mic nights. So like every night for a month, I was hitting open mics, and almost all they sang were American songs, and they sang them in English.
Yes.
And I said to one of the musicians one night, I said, why aren't you singing in French? And he says, oh, French isn't a good language for music. I was floored when he said that.
And that part of that came from this anxiety where French musicians just weren't taken seriously outside of France, that English, for better or for worse, has become the kind of lingua franca popular
So there's
music.
been a transition since then, and English actually has a more prominent role.
Oh
in
yeah,
that.
yeah. So English. I mean, there were the French were so concerned about it that in the 1990s they passed laws that mandated that a certain number of French language songs had to be played on the radio. Otherwise, it would just be all American pop songs or French versions of American pop songs. So, but in the same respect, there is this long tradition of anarchist songs and radical songs. That same kind of idea that we were talking about Bob Dylan earlier. The idea that he was drawing on this folk tradition to articulate as kind of anti-war sentiment.
Yeah.
There's this long tradition of anarchist songs and that are in this very popular style that coming from the 19th century that a number of people did draw on.
So there were French Woody Guthries that built into this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right?
But at one point, there was this generational gap between them where there was an older generation that really understand the world, this globalized world that young people in the 60s and 70s really lived in. That was so different.
Yeah. The song that I think seemed most radical at the time was the Rolling Stones' "Street Fighting Man."
Yeah.
And who was the French director? Godard? Didn't he do?
He did a long documentary on that.
And was it on that song, wasn't it? Or was
yes.
it was that song, and it just shows them in the studio going through the riffs over and over again and singing the lyrics. And I remember seeing that at some, small little underground theater somewhere for 50 cents or something, and it really seemed like it was more meaningful and serious than the other things that we were listening to and watching. But I guess what I was sampling was the intensity of the French musical experience there.
Well, and I think what the Rolling Stones were kind of speaking to was and almost this kind of something's missing in Great Britain. There's no place in London town for a street fighting man. Where in France there were students out on the streets throwing stones at policemen. So why isn't this happening here in London? And,
what can a poor boy do except sing for a rock and roll band?
Right, and what's fascinating is that in France, because television and radio went on strike in '68, there was really not a musical component to that. So they often were kind of left with English songs to articulate their feelings.
And I don't sense that this is reflected to that extent in England. I think maybe the punk movement in England was about the first time that got radical. Is that
and then in my book, I talk about how punk, punk again is this very international movement. And in fact, France was another place that was an important incubator for punk culture. A lot of American and British punk bands played their first shows in Paris.
They did. Tom Petty, for one, released American Girl over there first. And I bought it when I was in England that summer and didn't realize it was an American band until I got home. And then he was just catching on over here.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating to see that the French were always these kind of pioneers in many ways, but then in many ways were written out of the story.
Very good. We are going to take a quick commercial break. The Calumet Roundtable will be right back. Welcome back to the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. My guest today is Dr. Jonathyne Briggs, and we are continuing our discussion on pop music and French culture and world politics, I think. Jonathyne, something happened in 1971 that was significant in France. Tell us about that concert.
Absolutely. So there was a concert put together by a student group, and the student group was very much in the vein of these ideas we had been talking about before, wanting to kind of create some kind of political revolution. And part of it was that they were trying to use rock music as a way of instigating the revolution. But they also believed that rock music should be free and open to the people. So they put together a concert, but the promoters of the concert believe that there should be things like, tickets and costs and those things that go with the commercial aspect of rock music, right? Well, the students that showed up didn't think that that was right, so they tore down the gates and invaded this small stadium, and they ransacked the concession stand, and at the end of the night, all of this the concessions were raining down on the bands, and the electricity was eventually unplugged because nobody knew how to stop
So whoever
this.
just got to the concession stand was just throwing
It's just throwing, yes,
and
it's just
everything
kind of
all over.
this wild chaos that's and with rock music and lights in the air, and I mean certainly I'm sure that there were those that were there for other reasons, but the idea seemed to be that they were trying to imbue the spirit of this world they wanted to create. But unfortunately, the promoters called in the police, and so the riot police show up, and as the people are being forced out, the riot police begin to club down these students. So in many ways, it's kind of a replay on this very small scale of what happened in May of '68 in Paris, but this time over the issue of who has the right to access music, and should it be free? And
really a much less political issue to get into a riot over. Tell us about '68.
Well, I mean, certainly in '68, French students began to riot over what seems like a very kind of minor issue. They wanted to have co-ed access to the dorms. The idea at the time was that dormitories were sexually segregated, and this idea was that the university's policy was to kind of make sure to take care of their students as if they were their parents, right? So this was very common among many universities, but French students felt like this was too Puritan, almost too American in a way, you might say. So they began to protest against this, and the French authorities reacted terribly with way too much authority, and this gained the sympathy of larger and larger amounts of people. Eventually, gained the sympathy of workers, and then by the middle of May in 1968, you have about 1 million workers out on strike in France. And
that's what I remember about it. I didn't know this started over access to girls' dormitories.
Absolutely.
I didn't know it was such a worthy cause.
Yes. Well, the campus that started at was the campus in Nanterre, which is this very downtrodden suburb outside of France that is not unlike what we might understand the region to be at times. Very economically depressed area with students that had some privilege, and so they were trying to explore and get more freedom, which they saw as important, especially in light of the surroundings that they were in.
Interesting. So in '68, of course, we had the riot in Chicago, which was actually a police riot once they investigated it at the Democratic Convention. The other thing, as I'm thinking about the counterparts to this in America, at Woodstock, I believe some of the fences went down and a lot of people came in for free. And I think even I remember this because of the movie, the documentary they did on it. Somebody's little food stand got raided. Similar to what you were describing in '71.
And similar things happened in European festivals in 1970 at the Isle of Wight. Similar things happened.
The Isle of Wight concert. Oh my gosh, that was supposed to be heaven.
And so, in fact, French authorities were very concerned about controlling these crowds at the end, and they outlawed festivals for years. And so the French always had to leave France. The biggest French festivals were often, think about the Montreux Jazz Festival. It was really a French festival, but it had to be held in Switzerland because the French wouldn't allow these large festivals. And a big part of it was that, well, you get all these young people, like in '68, they're going to start rioting. So in many ways, it kind of put French music back.
So so how political was this really? I think if you look at, let's take '68 in Chicago and pull that out of the discussion, because that was clearly, it was at a Democratic convention. It clearly had political motivation. But if you look at some of these other things, it's people trying to get into the concert for free. They're stealing food. They want to get into the girls' dormitory. Is this really political in nature? Or is it just chaos? Is it just people rebelling for the sake of rebelling and just kind of doing what they want?
Yeah, and in some ways, you could argue it's a little bit of both. I think they imagined politics to be that the society that felt the need to segregate men and women was a society that believed that people couldn't control themselves, and so thus was a society that needed to be overthrown. Now, yes, of course, like this also meant that there are no laws, and so in a sense there is chaos. But
I mean, I would buy that argument if they were talking about, getting bread to poor people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think again that kind of speaks to then in the 1970s there were efforts then to say, well, we need to help workers. That workers.
Well, that legitimized it, didn't it?
Yeah. Unfortunately, the workers didn't want to have anything to do with them. So it's similar to workers here in the Chicagoland area during '68.
Right,
they saw these interlopers as not really representing their own values. So it was political, but in a kind of naive form of politics, if you will.
Yeah, when you think about it, it's kind of contrary to what you would expect when you think about how the union types were so opposed to all of those protests.
And it was the same in France. The unions did not want to strike, and they were kind of forced to by their younger members. And then once they got some concessions from the government, they called off the strike, which upset the students, and the student movement basically collapsed after that.
And I think it was in '69. It was the year after the convention in Chicago. They put the leaders of the protest movement in Chicago up on trial. It was called the Conspiracy 8 trial, and then they pulled out Bobby Seale, and it became the Conspiracy 7 trial, I think. And I was up there for that just about every day, and we just marched around the Federal Building, and we were joined one day by the spouses of the imprisoned leaders, and Abby Hoffman's wife was there, I think, and some people like that, and they had this banner. They were speaking on this stage, and my friend of mine and I happened to be in the front, and they asked us to carry the banner, and then we all marched around the Federal Building. So I'm going around, I'm starting down this march along the Federal Building, and I got like a couple hundred people in back of me, and somebody's shouting with a bullhorn, and all this excitement, and all of a sudden these vans pulled, or these cars pulled over, trucks, and these guys got out with hard hats on, and they lined themselves up in front of us like this, you guys aren't going anywhere. This is going to disperse, and it looked like a bunch of people from a work site somewhere that just got fed up with all of this hippie nonsense, and came over there to bust it up, and it was a very tangible moment for me, because I realized that we're only speaking for ourselves. This is not a a broad movement.
What a number of the students were doing in France is they would send these, basically what they believed to be like envoys into the factories to teach the workers how to be revolutionary. And it often got these students. They were beat up. They were threatened, and so the idea was that the problem was that the workers weren't revolutionary enough. We need the students to teach them, and that sort of idea did not fly with the. With the workers at all. What is interesting, though, is that I would feel in the United States that the crackdowns went on a little bit longer than they did in France. There were no real trials against student leaders in France of these movements. They kind of left them alone, and eventually many of these student leaders kind of found their way into what we might call traditional politics, and it really did affect the duration of these movements.
And we didn't, there wasn't much of a transition into politics here. There was. There were a few names, mostly involved in civil rights, Andrew Young and people like that, but not much from the.
And in France, there's a whole generation of politicians. They're known as the 68 or the 68ers.
Really?
Who moved on and got their degrees and entered politics, and the most famous one being Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who was one of the real figureheads of the movement, and he became a very important leader of the Green Party in West Germany. So
I want to organize the 68ers in the U.S. I think that's a great idea.
You have to hurry.
Unless we elect Bernie Sanders, and then there won't be any need for him. And I was also trying to do some comparisons here with some other things in the U.S. So, there was the Altamont concert during this period, Rolling Stones. And they made the mistake of asking the Hells Angels to be security at the concert, and somebody ended up getting killed. Were we more violent over here than?
Well, I would say that there was that sense. There was a greater sense of danger here. What happened at the end after '68 in France, in many cases, was that a lot of these revolutionaries decided to really embrace the commune movement. You know, it kind of happened here,
Yeah.
places like California,
Yeah.
even here in Indiana in some cases. But
Yeah.
but in France was a much larger movement. So I feel like they kind of retreated from society in many ways and tried to create their own kind of a true counterculture. And this didn't really work out for them.
So yeah, where's that counterculture now? Because I don't really see it in the U.S. It's more of a style thing. In the 70s, it became cool to have long hair and jeans with holes in them,
Right.
and it kind of sucked the essence out of everything.
Right, and I would say, like in France, a lot of it comes from and I mean, I would say in America here, a lot of it comes from the rap culture and mixtape culture and getting word from the street of what's really going on.
But
and
that's not a continuation of 68.
No,
That's more of an outgrowth of the.
Yeah, it's more of an outgrowth of like cultural politics. And I would say the same in France, where rap became this voice of the downtrodden immigrant communities.
So this French rap.
Oh yeah.
I can't imagine
It's quite lovely, actually.
I bet it would be, yeah.
I mean, French is so poetic in a way where it doesn't sound right with rock music, but with rap, which is just talking in a beautiful way.
Even rap sounds good in French.
Yeah, it sounds quite
I'm
fantastic.
amazed. When you say communities, and to kind of get back to where we started here, to what extent are they communities in the sense that maybe we had communities in the 60s in the United States? I mean, we didn't have communes everywhere, but we had a situation where, if you had long hair, you couldn't get a job, and you were sort of stigmatized, and people like that hung out together.
Right.
Is there anything like that today? Because that's not true in the U.S. anymore. Is there anything like that in France?
I mean, to be honest, I would say really no, but a lot of that comes from how the internet has changed the way that communities can be built. You can talk to people across the world and share ideas and values with them in a way that was very, very difficult in the 1960s and 70s even.
Yeah.
And so I would say that those things that would help us kind of connect before, they don't have the same kind of meaning today.
Okay.
But it's a different kind of community, I would say.
All right, very good. That's all the time we have on our program. Thank you. And thank you to Jonathyne Briggs for joining me today, Dr. Briggs, on the Calumet Roundtable. I'm your host, Tom Roach. Have a great day.